Well, I'd like to start off with maybe a show of hands of who's familiar with PE, SDIC, and CDP. Well, those are terminology in my line of work. So anyways, it was a joke, guys. Imagine saving thousands of dollars of taxes and doubling your retirement income. And that's what I want to talk to you about. As I see some of the parallels, and first, Brent and Amy, thank you. I think a round of applause, I know not a lot of a round of applause kind of went out to you guys, but thank you for hosting us and the opportunity to be here. We've had a really nice time. Plus, I coaxed my wife out on the slopes this morning. First off, Mike, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to come out. Mike had said to me, he said, with overhead up, with reimbursements down, medical malpractice increasing, when I think about, you talked about reimbursements, and I understand Barbara's going to be speaking about reimbursements following this. What about a reimbursement of your tax? That's one that many people, interesting enough, especially with this 8th book I've got coming out, the thing that mostly impacts, if not actually impacts almost everybody in this room, any high income earner, the thing that actually costs us the most, that ironically gets the least amount of attention, is tax. So think about some of these parallels, because I've sat in on some of the sessions. So, for example, the objectives of this meeting: techniques, challenges, new developments. And one of my favorite quotes is by Confucius. Tell me, I may forget. Show me, I may remember. Involve me, and I will understand. And I think it's great to see how there's a lot of inventions, obviously, coming out with innovation, right? And of course, invent. I'm sure there's a lot of great byproducts that come out of this meeting. But the big insights I took away that have a lot of parallels: surgical risk calculator, safety of patient, top priority, accuracy versus precision, reducing cost is desirable, what's the value of your time, the key in having a team of experts to support your specialty, and probably my favorite was people just don't hear you. And if almost everything you've been taught about retirement and taxes turned out not to be true, when would you want to know? Well, let's get into it. So, 21st century retirement, how to reinvent retirement. And when you think about retirement, and I've got a slew of information here I can share with you, I did bring some various books. And just as a quick show of hands in the room, how many of you are W-2? W-2 income, okay. What about those that are 1099, okay? And then what about those of you that run your own practice or your corporation, S Corp, C Corp? Okay, great. So I brought some of my top 10 most expensive tax mistakes business owners make, and then I'm going to actually talk to you about a Jim Harbaugh case that Mike had brought to my attention that was of interest to him. So I'm bringing him the facts on that I think will intrigue a lot of folks here. And that one's called the Business Owner Personal Protective Pension Plan. And in my most recent book, although I don't have the one that's about to come out, this will help you as I think about some of the clients, especially some of the retired doctors that I serve. They said if they could have their older self talk to their younger self, and I'm not just addressing, by the way, doctors in the room, also the Innovasis, team, because this is going to apply to everybody. Anybody who's a high income earner overpays taxes by at least $30,000 a year on average. $30,000. I'll show you a couple case studies of that. But I do have this book as well for those that are interested. So let's get into this. The new book, Stop, Saving Tax Optimization Plan. For us, if we don't get the taxes right, everything else is going to be inferior. And I've always shared, in fact, the last time I was in Utah, it was 14 years ago, I was addressing about 200 financial advisors. And one of the things that somebody quoted me on stage, they said, Chuck always emphasizes the importance of having an LLC, a lifetime learning commitment. And I think this is great with what Innovasis does as it relates to that. 2020 may be the top year to save your money. We've got one of the most contentious election years, arguably, in our history. We've got a war on wealth. And I think you'll see a lot of things that will help, especially being an 11-year bull run, that will help you and give you some good insights. I want to talk to you about what's coming. what's changed. There was a major piece of legislation just passed called the Secure Act, and it's anything but secure for most of the people in this room as it relates to having money in tax-deferred accounts. We'll talk about that. And learn how you can set yourself up to thrive in retirement. Not survive, but to thrive. And the interesting retired physicians I work with said, if my older self could talk to my younger self, I would say two things. I would, number one, say, don't follow the crowd. And two, pay more attention to taxes. Now, interesting enough, that feedback was a couple years ago, before a lot of what you're seeing about, let's just say, a slew of proposed taxes were even in discussion. And then we'll go through a couple medical professional case studies. Medical professionals in the sense of those medical professionals that support actual MDs or doctors, and then doctors themselves. So here's the thing I find in these events, especially when I've just been like a caged lion, can't wait to get up here. But when you're at the end of the day, some of you obviously skiing, it takes it out of you. I'd say the key thing that I would encourage you to think about is really, in the next few minutes, think about your thinking. Very, very rarely do people actually take the time to think about their thinking. And I love what Einstein, the world as we have created is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. This is probably the biggest thing I can share with you other than two words, and I'm going to try to emphasize, and I'm sure many of you being doctors are familiar with the fact that you'll retain about 60% more by actually writing down things that were kind of key insights, and I'll try to emphasize what I actually would suggest to you those things would be, because there's an actual correlation between the brain and the thumb. It's not coincidental when you rewrote or recopied your notes why you tested better. But this one's going to be tough to scribble down. But I'm going to give you two words before I go through this with you. And I think these would be two key words that would emphasize everything I'm going to share with you. Timing would be number one, and shifting would be number two. So let's talk about what we call the retirement freedom cycle. PR for present in the middle there. So if you look at the present, right, and this is all about innovation. The people that free themselves in retirement, they choose the future that they want. They want what they want because that's what they want. Ironically, though, they'll decide from going back into their past what they decide to utilize to put back into their present. So that's what we call the abundance mentality. Now let's contrast that with what we call the retirement captivity cycle. All right, if anyone hasn't been paying attention, we have a retirement crisis in this country, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I'll give you some good news as we go through here. And this is what we typically see. Maybe this is even related to some of the patients that you deal with, their mentality, or for those that work with doctors, maybe some of the relationship that you have in seeing this in some of the accounts that you serve. So many people will use their present, right, by deciding and looking back before they think about their future with their past. You know these people, right? Well, last time we tried that, it didn't work. I've always heard that was a bad thing. Somebody tried to sell that to my brother-in-law. I mean, there's an excuse after excuse. And then they'll use their past to utilize, right, what they decide to think about in their future. And if you notice, there's kind of a brick wall there that prevents them from actually getting the future that they want. It's kind of like a dog chasing its tail. Well, let's make a contrast so that people can understand that at the end of the day, whether it's spine surgery or whether it's effective retirement planning, people feel more confused, isolated, and powerless than ever before. I mean, all you have to do is pull up any of the tax plans being proposed in this, let's say, presidential election, and it's enough to make your head spin, okay? And it's going to get more and more confusing because the Secure Act changed. What did it change? So for some of you that may have been building these tax-deferred accounts to leave, let's say, to your children or to your family, no longer can you stretch that over their lifetime. They're going to have to liquidate those accounts within 10 years. That also includes Roth, 401k, or IRA. And that's changed the game. But really think about your thinking for a moment. They changed the rules on the back of the omnibus bill on December 20th of last year to push it through the Senate to keep the government open through next September 30th, and nobody really paid attention to that bill passing. And what did it do? Yeah, it helped implement, now think about your thinking, the ability to give a tax rebate for employers that open 401k plans for their employers. But let me ask you a question. And again, as a show of hands, how many feel taxes in the future will be lower? Holding out anybody in the audience for the flat tax, the taxes might be the same. Okay, so we got good. We got a couple outliers. That's good. How about, as a show of hands, nice and tall, taxes will be higher? Okay, great. That's part of involving you. So here's what we find. People, the number one, and I've had my practice for 24 years, and we do a lot of surveying, the number one thing that people are confused most about are losing money to taxes. 2, losing to the stock market. 3 would be feeling it's too late, right? Or most of the time, they'll say, you know what, I just lack a plan. And what people are really seeking, okay, growth, access, and transfer of their money, tax-free. And I know everyone talks about tax-free. We'll talk to you about how to do it. Prevent market losses. And then, of course, move savings from these types of tax-deferred accounts. So ask yourself this question. If you feel taxes are going to be higher, do you realize that if I had a loan for you to consider, you would have 2 questions. What are you going to charge me? And what are you going to, when do you want the money back? And if I say, well, here are the terms. We already have somebody shook up. Here are the terms. Now we'll charge you at 72, because that changed in the Secure Act as well for anybody that wasn't 70.5 before the end of 2019. And then I'll tell you what, at that time, when you're forced to take that money out, I'll tell you what, then we'll let you know what we've decided the interest rate will be. That's not on the 401k enrollment form, I'm sure, for most of you. Okay? So let's talk about what clients have taken away from the Hidden Wealth Solution. Number 1 is the ability to thrive through safety and security. That's key, right? As somebody said up here, we need to be able to sleep at night as well. That's what really keeps people up at night, is when's the market going to correct? When could it possibly crash? And how bad could taxes get? And how many of these ridiculous commercials am I going to see between now and November 3rd, right? Or somebody going off a cliff, or who knows what else, right? And leave a legacy, right? Just like the mission work that you all do in Peru, what's your legacy? Have you defined it? Do you know what it is? Because I doubt it's indirectly making Uncle Sam your biggest business partner. Because isn't it interesting how we call it a 401k or a SEP, but what is it really? Early mornings, late nights, missed ball games, missed recitals. It's interesting when you don't call it by name. So, reinventing retirement reality. So baby boomers, and I'm going to guess most of us, without aging, some of you in the room are at least baby boomers. I did get a little bit of demographic information from Mike, so I'm kind of talking to the boomers in the room, but even more important would be any generation for that matter. We're the first generation in history. Now think about your thinking here. The first generation in history to have to self-insure our own retirement. And you'll see the stats on that in just a second. Timing and shifting, back to those key 2 words. Strategies, they're essential right now. 2020 may be the most important year as it relates to your money. 2020. And then the Trump tax plan saving dates, they're running out. So whether Trump gets reelected or not, I'm not here to debate politics with any of you in the room, although I'll be happy to talk to you about it out of the room, is the fact that even if he's reelected, and as good a negotiator as he may be, he's not going to negotiate a 3rd term. His Tax Cut and Jobs Act is going to sunset. And for most people in this room, you're going to jump tax brackets like you've never seen before, especially with some of the new proposals. So taking advantage, back to that word timing, is going to be key. And then protection from the unknowns. And boy, are there a lot of unknowns. We have a conference that we were supposed to attend in Japan. It's already been canceled, and that's for October. This coronavirus thing, without getting too off kilter here, is obviously something that nobody saw in the markets and hit the markets pretty hard last week, right? There's a lot of outliers, a lot of things that we can't control. So here's what we're going to talk about. If there were any of the top risks, these would be the risks. And it's interesting, too, the parallel as it relates to, as I heard in one of the talks, with regards to obviously an aging demographic with what you all do. It's fascinating to think about, and this is an interesting statistic that I'll be sharing with you in a moment, but do you realize by about 2034, there'll be more people over the age of 65 in our country than people the age of 18 or younger? It's the first time that's ever happened in our history. That's going to definitely change the game. So longevity risk, income and tax rate risk, inflation and interest rate risk, sequence of return. See, right now, the good parts we've been in this bull run. The sad part about this bull run is this may be one of the worst timing, potentials for timing of, let's say, the bull run coming to an end that is really going to change the dynamics for a lot of people's retirement in this room. But I'm going to teach you some things that you can do about that. Protect your downside, but don't give up your upside. And then market volatility risk. So think about this. We are what we call the sandwich, for a lot of us in the room, the sandwich generation. We're the hamburger being squeezed between the two buns, right? Helping older parents, as well as getting children to and through school. And then, oh, by the way, we're supposed to plan our own retirement somewhere in between, right? And gone are the days of the, walk away from your employer for 30 years with the guaranteed pension payment. And think about that. Only 7.5% of companies actually still have a defined benefit pension, down from 85% going back to 91. More defined contribution plans, and then, of course, income sources are changing. So securities at risk, pensions are clearly underfunded, which we'll talk about that, and retirement savings, obviously, is typically trapped in tax deferred. So life expectancy, 50% odds of reaching age 90 if you're 65 today. Now think about that. Now I don't know how those statistics line up with what you all do in spine surgery, but with what we do in retirement, that's a blessing and a curse, right? If you've got quality of life, great. If you have no quality of life and no protection plan, life might not be so fun. Add to the fact, right, as I like to say, shift happens, and back to that statistic, adults 65 or older will outnumber children 18 or younger by 2034. That's a pretty big shift. That'll have an impact on a lot of things that impact all of us in this room. And then, of course, I don't need to explain to you the rising cost of healthcare, right? Thinking about that the system, thinking of 2027, total spending, this is coming from Medicare and Medicaid service reports, will likely reach a staggering $60 trillion, almost in line with Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All program over the next 10 years. The system would be funded almost entirely, I underlined it for you, tax dollars. And guess whose taxes? If you want to write this down, there's ours. So write the word ours down. You'll get a kick out of this. Ours and theirs. Then as soon as you write the word theirs, just take a line straight down the middle of the word theirs. And what does that spell? The IRS. High income earners and strong savers in tax deferred accounts will be footing the bill, and that's unfortunate. So, national debt. Now this is one I really want to jump into. The national debt's going to have a major impact, okay? But think about your thinking, because when I ask people this, they're astonished about how we funded World War II, okay? So back in 1942, we came up with a 94% top tax rate. Right? So can you imagine going to work and coming home and say, hey, honey, I just knocked down 6 cents of every dollar today. We had a good day, right? In taxes, if you look at the tax code, since its inception, taxes have actually averaged 60% top tax rate. So I know it seems strange because we've taken a lot of things away from the equation, but right now we're in the lowest tax rates we've seen in 30 years. So again, back to that timing piece. But let me emphasize to you, kind of putting into a little bit of context with relating this to a visual, right? This is $1 billion. This is roughly a 6 foot, 200 pound person standing beside this. This is $1 trillion, okay? This is what we're adding to our deficit annually, okay? Now, here's a quick question. How long does it take to spend $1 trillion? So, of $1 trillion, if you spend $1 every second, that's $86,400 in a day. That's $31,500,000 a year. This is where I'm going to involve you. Who would like to take a stab at how long, at this pace, it would take to spend $1 trillion? This is where you actually participate in the involvement. 20,000? 3,000 years. Over 32,000 years. Now, I'd love to try to spend $31,500,000 a year. I think I could get that down a little bit, but wow. When you see that, I think a lot of people are taken back. Like that kind of pushes the human mind a little bit, right? Now, then we got all this other stuff we got to deal with, right? Coronavirus threat. And I don't know if you know this, but talk about people that don't think about their thinking. Do you know when the coronavirus was first released that the #1 Google search, Corona beer virus? That's not made up. That's true. Does anybody else kind of worry about the future of our country? Trade tariffs, Iranian threat, North Korean nuclear, terrorism. I mean, the list goes on and on. Let's talk about sequence of return risk. And I love all the studies that you guys talk about in this conference. And this is one that we study regularly, and this is called the Dalbar study. And this tracks average equity investor returns for the prior 30 years. And this is real statistics, folks. This doesn't have a tax cost. This doesn't include management costs. This is just pure return before cost and expenses in the form of tax. Tax, if you want to make a note, is about a 1% cost drag if you're an average income earner. So here it might be 1.5, closer to 1.5. So average investor return 3.88%. Why? Because you have to count 2007 to 2009 when people lost on average 57%. Average fixed income is if there's someplace safe to seek fixed income, less than 0.25%. And of course, you can read the rest of that. But inflation itself is running at about 2%. But remember, inflation, the way the government tracks it, excludes food and energy. Now, we have 2 sons in college, okay? And food and energy would have to rank up there as 2 of the highest spending items on our family balance sheet. So I think inflation is not tracked accurately, okay? So what's changed, what's being proposed? I like to call these in my books the government gotchas. So the required minimum distribution, so for a lot of people in here, what that means is, if you're not familiar, at an age of 72 now, effective this year, 2020, it used to be 70.5. You have the ability for the government not to force you to take money out of your former 401ks or IRAs. If you do not take this government-mandated formula, it is a 50% penalty of what that number needed to be. So let's say your required minimum distribution, let's just say give or take, is for a lot of people, depending on what you saved in your 401ks or IRAs, maybe that's $100,000, okay? We have a lot of doctors that we serve that they're RMDs, which is why many of their older selves would have liked to talk to their younger selves about not doing so much tax deferred. So that means if you don't take the $100,000, the government gets to fine you $50,000. Now, understand that the federal government made $6 billion off of that penalty last year. So it's a nice little revenue source for the government. And then no more stretch IRAs. And if any of you in the room have listed your trust as the beneficiary of your IRAs or your 401ks, please seek out legal counsel and get that reviewed, because it changed the game. The changing of no longer the stretch IRA and the forced 10-year distribution has changed. Now, I'm not going to go through every one of these with you, but these are the new things being proposed. Universal basic income, freedom dividend, corporate tax rate back up to 35%, financial tax, transaction tax, Green New Deal tax. A big one is what's called the removal of the step-up in basis. So for a lot of us in the room where we talk about being the hamburger, right, generation, and we have older parents, unfortunately, there's quite a few proposals to get rid of the step-up in basis. And what that relates to is that when our parents pass, okay, and both of my parents are deceased, when both of our parents pass, your parents pass, then what is inherited, you have to inherit it now at their basis. Do you know what some parents have paid for properties, let's say in Northern and Southern California? I'm going to guess it's a lot less than what the values are today. I can talk about Florida. Maybe they spent $35,000. They'd probably inherit somewhere around $350 to $650, which means in the old days, prior to this being passed, you would get a step up in basis. So whatever the value of what you were inheriting, let's say from your parents, the value was reassessed at the time of their passing. Therefore, you could obviously inherit that asset, sell that asset, and not recognize a capital gain. But the challenge is now many people are proposing a 40% capital gain tax rate. See, under Trump, under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, depending on where you can get your income, you can actually have a zero capital gains tax rate. In fact, I'll teach you a way to actually zero out your capital gains, especially for those that might be holding on to a highly appreciated asset. I'll talk to you about a case study of a doctor that sold a portion of his practice and taking care of capital gains. Obviously, many are being proposed to have capital gain tax rate at ordinary income tax rates. And again, if they retract or when it eventually goes back and sunsets of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, that'll put the highest federal tax rate back to basically 40%. So Fortune, I'm not going to go through this too much in depth, especially for time's sake, but when you've got the Brookings Institute, which is not, let's say, an advocate of the GOP, already making, especially with the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projections of our country with the deficit that we hold today. This may be one of the most important things I share with you, of what is happening in Europe called a VAT tax, a value-added tax. It's right now proposed that as of right now, with the deficits that we have, not funding all these other things that are being talked about, that we would need either a 20% to as high as a 40% value-added tax. Now, I don't know what that'll do to spine surgery, but that, as far as the cost of goods and so forth, that's going to be pretty, I mean, that's a tax in itself, right? Kind of a hidden tax, if you will. And if that's not enough, especially for those of you that may have 10 years or longer to work by choice, hopefully, the unfortunate part is then adding 8.5% to the payroll tax, which basically moves that from about 15% to almost 24%. So what we're hearing is it's going to be a combination. It's going to be adding 50% to the payroll tax and then incorporating this value-added tax. And I don't share this with you to fearmonger anybody in this room. I would just say, please prepare yourself, because this is what's happening before a lot of the new tax proposals would have ever even taken effect. So, taxing the rich won't get us close. Now, this is the Brookings Institute study. If we move the top tax rate to 70%, imposed a 6% wealth tax, a 50% capital gains tax, and then tax people's estates by 77%, we won't even get halfway there. So, now that I've depressed you all, let's transition. What do? Well, planning is going to be key. Proactive planning is going to be key. And I want to teach you how you can thrive through this. So one of the first things that we talk about, why I was so driven to write a book on this, is what we call the STOP program, Saving Tax Optimization Plan. Stop overpaying tax. And this is an actual client. As I said earlier, if you don't get the taxes right, everything else is going to be inferior. And this particular client, they were overpaying taxes by about $73,000 a year. Now, this is going to be no differently than DNA, no two people having the same tax plan, but I can assure you that all of you in this room are overpaying tax or will unfortunately expose yourself to overpaying tax if you don't do something about it. Many of you, I'm sure, are not doing jumping jacks even on the lowest tax rates you've seen in 30 years with the taxes that you likely pay today. Now, my favorite, because we have an entire tax team, a 34-year certified tax master, estate planning attorney, we have kind of the full package, is when someone says, well, you know, my CPA is not familiar with these types of strategies. Well, let's talk about that. Understand there's not one course of curriculum in the CPA designation on tax savings planning, not one. So many people find that they have more of what we call a tier 1 accounting relationship. That's somebody who tells them what they owe after they report the damage and then have that discussion after the smoke is cleared when nothing else can actually be done to prevent it, okay? Now contrast that with the difference of somebody not just telling you what you owe, but then turning around and teaching you how much less you have to pay. And that frees up a lot of cash flow that you can put back into your practice. That's cash flow you can put back towards your retirement and other things. And of course, you know, as you see Archimedes here, he sees a lever to move the world, but one person sees it very singular, kind of like the one slide I really appreciated where the two gentlemen are on the back side of the number 6, if you're looking at it from one direction, or the number 9 looking at the other, right? We can all see the same thing and ultimately see it differently. My other favorite is where we had a client said, look, for the 5th time, I asked my advisor of 30 years about how we're planning taxes. And I'll never forget this woman. She said to me, she said, he finally looked at me and said, taxes are just part of the equation. Kind of like, get over it, lady. You're going to have to pay taxes. She said, Chuck, it only took 5 times, but we realized we needed to do something different. So it's true. You can't get a second opinion from the person that gave you the first one, really, because the first person already gave you their first best opinion. That's my favorite. Well, we went back and we talked to our financial advisor of 30 years. He's not familiar with these things. So remember that captivity mentality? So it must not exist. Okay. So here's how we avoid the government gotchas. Deferred taxes, folks, equal increased taxes. Here's really the sad reality. Even if tax rates don't go up, and I'll talk to you about a case study of one of our medical professionals. In fact, he gave me a really nice, almost like an interview, because I wanted to create as much value for those of you here as I could. He said, Chuck, in my practice, my income started at about $300,000 and it quickly climbed in 15 years to $1.3 million. And he said, I just wasn't prepared. And when you really think about that, think about even if tax rates don't go up, the cost of living will. Which means if we have to take out this much more of a larger distribution to still get to the net needed distribution that's now gone up with inflation, automatically what happens is people get pushed into a higher marginal tax bracket. So the sad reality is even if tax rates don't go up, right, our taxes, for most of us, without tax planning, will. Forced retirement income being an RMD, requirement of distribution. What I typically see is what I try to prevent people from becoming what's called the perfect government taxpayer in my books. And that's where ultimately you literally see people that 85% of their Social Security is being taxed. If you don't watch your income in retirement, you end up getting hit with what's called a Medicare Part B and D surcharge, where you're now supplementing at about $300 a month per spouse back into the system being deducted from your Social Security. And of course, increased family inheritance tax, depending on how you hold entitled assets. So here's where I want to make a quick transition, because this tends to be one of the things that we see to be very, very predictable, is the 401k. And how quickly we can forget from 10 years ago, this being the cover of Time magazine, where it said it was time to retire the 401k. In fact, I didn't create a slide for this, but the father of the 401k, by the name of Ted Benna, he would tell you in publication after publication, it's time, especially over the last 5 years, to blow up the 401k. Now, understand there's good things about certain design 401ks if there's a Roth option. So hopefully I'm not stepping on anybody's toes as I'm going over the 401k, but I'm surely not going to mince my words. This is a tax-deferred trap for most people, and it's served, unfortunately, Wall Street way more than it served Main Street. And you'll see why. And Benno said because it was runaway costs. Do you understand the Department of Labor has come out, and this is one of the positives that happened in Dodd-Frank, with disclosure of the disclosed and undisclosed costs. And I'll show you what those are, but if you want to write them down, in a 401k, it averages 3.17%. And there's a roughly 88 basis points, closer to 1.8, about 188 basis points, depending on the size of the 401k, of just an added 401k fee. So fees can be excessive, but unfortunately the choices, the options that most people have, which you'll find interesting, an actual case that happened 3 years ago, Morgan Stanley's own employees sued their employer for picking the most inferior, most expensive, and profitable 401k choices that they could even have in their own 401k plan. I was sharing with Amy last night, we actually have an Outlook folder in our office, and it's titled, "You Can't Make This Stuff Up." And I probably put an article in there similar a week. I mean, think about that. Morgan Stanley, by the way, if anyone's not familiar, they're in the business of 401ks. The Economic Policy Institute came out and said 401ks have failed most American workers. Here's that cost, as I shared with you, whether it's a non-taxable account or taxable account, typically related to mutual funds. Mutual funds have been kind of the darling of the day, and this is right out of Forbes. Tax deposit, 401k deposits. Do you want to pay tax on the seed? So if you're a farmer, Would you rather pay tax on the seed in the springtime or pay tax on the harvest in the fall? Seed or harvest? Yeah, on the seed. Now watch how this works. So just play along. Many of you are putting way more than $6,000 into your 401k, but let's just say you're putting $6,000 in there for 30 years. That's 180 grand. Let's assume maybe your tax bracket's 33 and a third. That's $2,000 that you're being told you're saving. Remember, you're not saving tax, you're deferring the tax. That's 60 grand, right? 2,000 times 30, right? Now watch. If the account that you've put the money in has averaged 6%, then the withdrawal is going to be 30 grand. And if you're still lucky enough to be in the same tax bracket you were pre-tax versus post-tax, you will have paid back all of the tax-deferred savings in 6 years. 3 years, under 2 years. That's not on the 401k enrollment form for most people. So why would you forego 30 years to give it all back in 2 to 6? And that's assuming tax rates don't go up. So reinventing retirement. Here's how the wealthy invest. See, my story is simple. This is about you. It's not about me, but I want to make sure you understand. I sit with people on a weekly basis. Don't just write books or host a national radio show. Sit with people. Boots on the ground, as one client said. You know, Chuck, I love it because you got boots on the ground. I'm just a maniac in studying this stuff. And mainly it's because I can tell you how to overpay taxes. And I thought I was pretty astute as it related to taxes. And I can definitely tell you how to take a beating in the stock market, right? I got really greedy back in 2000, 99, going into 2000. And I surely don't blame anyone other than taking the accountability and responsibility myself. But wow, it's amazing how much more we can learn from our bad experiences than we do from our good experiences, if we're being honest. So I went on a quest. And I'm going to talk to you about 3 solutions, and we'll wrap up. Hopefully, I was hoping to leave some time for questions. Mike said I had till 8. Is that still good with everybody? Just kidding. But I'll try to get through this as quick as I can because I really want to give you some solutions, something you'll walk away and have a good return of your time. So how they invest. So institutional portfolio management, kind of like as much as you guys go into depth and scope of these studies and the predictability of outcomes and so forth. Special designed insurance, I'm going to talk to you about what the ultra wealthy use, whether it's Roy Williams with the University of North Carolina in basketball, or we're talking about Jim Harbaugh coaching University of Michigan, or we're talking about the biggest banks or corporations. And then outside of Wall Street opportunities, we'll talk about private equity. Most people, you'd have to have an income of $200,000 or more to participate in that arena, but you'll find that the 2 largest endowments in this country actually have over 60% of their total holdings in actually alternatives like private equity. So first, let's talk about portfolio improvement analysis and stress testing. We have never met someone now in a number of years, now that we have the technology, that has ever put things under the microscope. To take the retirement road of their assets, their exposure, what we call standard deviation, the technical terminology for risk in our industry, and compared it to actual real returns. And by going through this, think about this for just a second. Here's Morningstar with a quote, and we actually use some Morningstar customized portfolios. Better decision making can increase retirement income by as much as roughly a third, right? And they don't even talk about taxes. For most people, taxes alone would save you a third. So let's get into this. Here, in kind of in this particular area, because it's hard to see on kind of these donut illustrations, on the left was where we actually analyzed a doctor's portfolio, and it showed that he had averaged over 20 years, the last 20 years, and it's accurate, 5.16%, taking a 12.3 risk. So to put that risk percentage in perspective, the S&P hovers right around 15 to 18, okay? Gold and silver would be a 33 on that scale. And then finding, by answering questions, kind of like some of you talked about whether you would take a patient or what type of procedure you would use, you can actually customize it to the specifics of that individual, right? And in this particular case, it's not about giving up upside, right, by protecting yourself more so to the downside. We're actually able to drop his risk in more than half and almost double the return. We see that very often. In fact, I think we've had 2 cases in the last 2 years where we weren't able to reduce risk, improve return, and simultaneously cut costs. And a big part of this, so you understand, is the big contrast, and if you make a mental note of this, of retail versus institutional. See, retail would be pretty much all the companies you see on TV that sponsor the Super Bowls, et cetera. Institutional would be the folks that are managing endowments, pension funds that are actually profitable, and ultra-wealthy individuals. And as a result of that, what we do is then take it and stress test it under the worst case scenario. Now, we run this under the 10th percentile of what's called a Monte Carlo simulation, so we can not show any bias or do any cherry picking. We can actually run it through 1,000 variations. And actually, if you look under the present, if we looked at the worst case, that particular client's portfolio by long term would grow to 4.5 million in comparison to dropping the risk and improving the return to not quite double. We see that quite often as well. So let's transition. What's referred to as the rich man's Roth. It's an alternative to 401k. See, there's a lot of limitations, right? Whether you're in a SEP or a 401k, any type of typical ERISA-driven programs are going to have some type of a contribution limitation. Well, you'll see that sometimes people don't want that. But here's what we do know what people want, right? They want the money to transfer or pass tax-free. They want the money to grow without tax, and they definitely want the ability to access their money without tax. And for some of you in the room, that's well before you have to worry about, there's no issue of you having to be 59 and a half to have access to your money. It just blows my mind how many people really have like 90% plus of all of their hard-earned work tax deferred, and they just feel trapped. So interesting enough that many people don't know what they don't know is that the largest assets of the three biggest banks and brokerages in this country actually hold this asset. Okay, and when you've got Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, they actually have more in this asset than all of the physical real estate that they own combined. So that should really get you scratching your head, because SDIC, special designed insurance contracts, right? For most people, this would typically be the topic that I find with most of the folks that we work with, that when they hear the word insurance, it usually doesn't have a very positive context, because most people in this room have been pitched on just about everything under the sun. True? Oh, if you're being honest, you know that's true. But let's think about, right, if we called it something else. If we called it lock-in and reset. So here's a perfect example here at Deer Valley. I worked hard to have my team put this slide in. I never would have got my wife on that apparatus, but let's say the market takes a hit. Would you rather go screaming right back down the hill, right, or have a mechanism that locks you in right where you lost power? Right? That's obviously a rhetorical question. But then as power's restored, the ability to then advance, but getting the advantage of being able to advance from where you were up, not from having to retreat or ascend all the way back down the mountain and then start your game. This is how you outperform the market, folks, with a different engineering of tools like Innovasis has in what you do in your practice, different engineering of tools in how we work with wealth creation in our practice. And here it is head to head. On the left-hand side of this slide over the last 20 years is investing. And understand, Wall Street's whole goal is to get as close to the performance of the S&P 500 as they can. And here's a shocker, no one's ever done it. So what John Bogle, the famous creator of Vanguard, said years ago, he said, why in the world would people pay someone to underperform the market? Right? That's why he pitched the Vanguard S&P 500 fund. But remember, the S&P 500 Vanguard fund doesn't have a floor. And many people unfortunately found that out in 08 into early 09. On the right side is indexing. Okay? So take that slide and just cut it straight down the middle. And let's start off with $500,000. Remember I was talking earlier, I said sequence of return, or the unfortunate 11-year bull run eventually comes to a head. I don't wish that on anybody, but at the same time, we know it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Well, you wouldn't want that if you were retiring in 2000. That would have been a horrible year to retire. We adopted a client that ended up having to unretire. But watch what happened if people didn't learn their lesson the first time, how they ended up having to learn the lesson a second time. So all the way down through here, 500 becomes 299. 299 becomes 499. Whammo, it almost becomes 299 again. And if you take that all the way down to the bottom, that's $1,000,001 based on starting basis of 500 grand. Well, if you inflation adjust that, folks, 20 years later, it really hasn't gone very far, because the cost of living is definitely doubled within that time frame, okay, for a lot of people, or at least a lot of things. On the right side, picture it, as the market loses, right, on the right side, we have a lock-in. So it stays when the market stops. And then it goes up when the market goes up. So as I like to write about my books, upside opportunity with downside protection. Now, here's the sad part. In the prospectus of several of the investments that are offered, they'll offer you the bottom number, that 13.65. That's called a compounding rate of return, an average rate of return. Now, it's actually a compounding annual rate of return of 5.63. Now, fascinating enough, they can still legally get away, and we're not anti-market. We just use it differently, like I demonstrated before, with custom designed portfolios using institutional as opposed to retail. But folks, 5.63, you might look at that and say, okay, 5.63 versus 7.06, give or take. It's the engineering. It's not the percentage, folks, just like you've heard that saying growing up. It's not what you make, it's what you keep. Look at the difference. It's over $1 million. And this is real math. So, top deferred compensation plan, special design insurance. Let me show you how this works. BOLI, if you've heard the terminology, or COLI, bank-owned life insurance or corporate-owned life insurance. By the way, this has been around since the 30s and 40s. So this isn't new. But isn't it interesting that the three largest brokerages owned by the three largest banks, which you might find interesting, not a one of those advisors is able to offer it. So it should have you kind of scratching your head like, well, why would that be? And understand, Jamie Dimon with JP Morgan Chase, et cetera, this is his pension plan. So is it more about telling you that they're managing your money, or more about telling you or showing you that they're protecting your money? There's a big difference. COLI's corporate-owned life insurance. So here's Jim Harbaugh, University of Michigan head coach. He became the highest paid college football coach in 2016 because $2 million is being put into a special design insurance contract by the University of Michigan. And here's what's interesting, because we do this for a practice that I'll teach you about later here as we wrap up. They borrowed the money. They didn't even use their own money. It's what we call OPM, and we don't mean the drug. Other people's money. And look at the results of this, and this is under conservative estimates. So $14 million is going in. Jim, between 66 and 98, he was 52 years old when this policy was taken. His benefit is going to be $1.4 million, and because of what we call TEFRA, DEFRA, TAMR, or the tax citations that I showed you earlier, 7702 and 72E, it's all tax-free. There's no place to report this on a tax return 1040 if you wanted to. It's not a loophole. It's not pushing the envelope. It's what Hillary Clinton's disclosure were of what was owned by the six of them by the Clinton family of her 6 blind trusts. This is not new. Former presidents, J.C. Penney, Walt Disney, this goes back a ways. But it'll pay out almost $50 million, assuming he gets to 98, all tax-free, and will still pass $35 million to his children and his spouse. Now think about this for a second. Jim Harbaugh making $7 million a year. Do you think he could retire by putting $25,000 a year away into the University of Michigan's 401k plan? Income even remotely close to an inflation-adjusted income when he wanted to now live off of his assets as opposed to being a Big Ten football coach? And let's face it, I'm from Ohio. This is very difficult to talk about, the state up north, but it's a good case study. Big Ten football coach's lifespan maybe 10 years, but he set himself up. Nick Saban wasn't really motivated by this, for any Alabama fans out there, which was really cool because his agent actually put a clause in his contract that said you'll always be paid $1 million more than the next highest paid college football coach. So he was rooting for Harbaugh's increase because he got $1 million bump as a result of it. So let me walk you through this case study. And I'm going to kind of set a couple quick things here. I don't care if you're 50, 55, 60, 35. I just randomly picked a median age of 50, okay? And I'm not saying that you'll have to work till 70, so you can kind of use your own mind, if you will, as it relates to typically having maybe a 20-year lookout. We can run this for 10 years, 5 years, it makes no difference. But going under these parameters, and we're going to make a couple assumptions here. Working tax rate at 24%, and just bear with me because this one is going to be worth your time. And a retirement tax rate of 33%. And then let's add to the fact, and if I had the live case study, because there was no way I was going to get this all in time if I had this as a live case study, but this is one of the things we go over with each individual client. Those little triangles you see there would actually push out what the average costs are. I already showed you what the average costs are, but I'm going to give this the benefit of the doubt that the average cost is only 2.5%. And then for those of you that aren't familiar, as of through the end of this last year, the average rate of return has been 4.83% on the S&P. In this particular design, with the upside without the downside, the average return has been 6.54, so I rounded it down. But here's what I want to really show you. And this is really interesting. This is somebody, maybe it's a SEP. I had to use this 26,316 number because at 24%, what I'm contrasting here is somebody putting in 26,000 pre-tax versus the right side, let's say that after the 24% tax, should they choose an alternative route, would it be $20,000, okay? So you had 26 pre-tax. If you chose to pay the tax and use the seed, it would only be 20. Now watch this. We're going to give a healthy 50% match. Most people think the match is huge. The match might get you 3 years, and it only increases the taxes, and you'll see. So let's go through this. To get a $64,000 tax-free income, and this is a client putting in $20,000 a year, as you can see this, and as a result of this, okay, and they did it $20,000 a year for 10, right, and then started drawing the money 10 years later, that gross return, assuming tax rates are 33 1/3, you're going to have to take out $96,000 to net 64. Is everybody with me? This is key. If you could only see you from my vantage point. We're almost done, guys. It's okay. Okay? Wow. This gives a speaker a lot of confidence, let me tell you. Hopefully it's just you're tired or you're just...
How about if I wake us up by asking a question?
Sure.
So that $20,000 tax-free plan, you're not taking into account that we lost the tax savings by putting money away into 401k or whatever it might be. So it's actually more than $20,000.
No, I am. I'm giving you credit on the left side. You actually put away 26. Mine, you only did 20. It's giving you credit. So watch what happens. And I'm giving you a 50% match. So let's say at 85, because this is, the client actually runs out of money at 82. Spoiler alert, it's in the bottom left. Now watch what happens. When your CPA talked to you about this, I'm sure they pointed out the fact that you're going to have almost $400,000 in fees, right? Add to the fact that, add to the fact that you're going to have fees that actually exceed the taxes. And the net income was 801. So let's put this in perspective. Between the fees and the taxes, you paid more than what you were actually able to take out as income. So let's look at the contrast of the difference. Gone at 82 versus the net advantages. It's what we call the $1.5 million mistake in this case study. And this is assuming, folks, tax rates don't exceed 33 1/3%. This is assuming a 50% match, and the list goes on and on. But let me ask you, does the 401k or SEP provide long-term care, critical illness, and critical injury? No one's ever answered yes to that. So pray you don't need it, but better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So here's the final case studies, as I think I should stay on time here. Roth conversion. So this is a client age 60, $410,000 in their IRA or 401k, however you want to look at it. They had this actually rolled over from a prior employer from a 401k to IRA. The current tax road would be increasing required minimum distributions, higher marginal tax rate, because a lot of times people get bumped up when they have to take that RMD. 85% of their Social Security was going to be taxed, and unfortunately reduced an unfavorable tax legacy. Now this is how we can analyze the road of risk or exposure that they're on. Making no recommendation. We're not biased to any one of the strategies I'm about to show you. We're biased to the strategies that actually best fit that client. The alternative tax road is reduced required minimum distributions, lower marginal tax rates, less Social Security tax with increased legacy. So here was the outcome. Now, fascinating enough, as we flash forward, assuming tax rates stay as they are under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, okay, client gets pushed to a 32% bracket at age 81 and up to a 35% bracket at age 83. Remember, most of the time, a couple 65 or older is going to have a 50% chance of one spouse getting, right, to 90. The difference without any, if you see my parentheses at the bottom, assumes no tax savings offset, was a difference of about $1.2 million. The IRA income tax total over that period was $1.7 million. The Roth conversion tax was $544. I don't even like the $544. So if there's strategies to come in and offset the tax, so if anyone's told you the Roth IRA is just the end-all be-all, just make sure you understand no one put in to many of these online articles the calculation on what's called lost opportunity cost, right? When you forfeit the tax, you also forfeit the potential earnings of where that tax obviously went. So the idea would be to figure out a strategy to have a tax strategy that you could use on one side that pays for the tax conversion on the other side. So let's look at how that works. See, if you move $100,000 out of an IRA, okay, and let's say, as you know, being in a progressive tax system, the last dollars obviously that you're taking out are obviously taxed at the highest rate, and right now that's 37%. Then that's going to create a $37,000 tax. But by using a really interesting, what we call the energy independence account that Trump bumped up, kind of like he's done under Section 179 with being able to obviously accelerate depreciation, you have the ability to take up to a 100% tax deduction in the same year. And if you want to make a note, that's between 2018 and 2022. We saved about $18 million of taxes last year just using this strategy I'm about to show you. So by taking cash, and let's say it's cash that's obviously beyond someone's cash reserve needs. We're not saying go out and liquidate your cash reserves, but many people are sitting on a lot of cash that we work with. And as a result of that, by taking that cash and employing it, they create over here a $37,000 tax deduction, which means, especially for people in the room that are still working, that means two things. You can either use that deduction to reduce your taxable income by 100 grand, or you could use that $37,000 deduction to convert 100,000 out of your IRA to a Roth IRA, zero washing the tax. So the energy independence account, just so you understand, is not just used for the tax deduction. Now, this is not wildcatting in the oil space. This is an emphasis of the Permian Basin. This is what Trump wanted. Again, I'm not touting Trump. I'm just making you aware of the things he put into the Tax Cut and Jobs Act to become the world's largest oil producer, which he did. And as a result of that, you get on the right-hand side up to 100% tax deduction. But also, as that actual account produces, so these are shallow drillers. These are the folks that are kind of feeding the big refiners, the Exxon Mobils, if you will. And Trump knew that we had to be dependent on the efficiency and the effectiveness of those that were the most strategic of getting what's actually been documented, 500 years of oil out of the ground. So it's not like we're trying to strike out oil, folks. It's just getting the oil out of the ground. And as a result of that, your two biggest purchasers of these particular programs are pension funds for the income and big refiners. And as a result, it's obviously proving itself. But the dividend, as the project starts to produce profit beyond expenses, is 15% tax exempt. But it also has a long-term capital gain tax treatment, unlike an IRA that's going to have an income tax treatment. And here's the biggie. As of today, depending on the outcome of this election or a future election, it avoids an inheritance tax because the project, and I'll give you a history of two of our projects. I promised one person in the room, this was actually a private equity fund by a former Harvard grad by the name of Thomas Powell, and has done very well in this. It's a $1.5 billion company that he took from about $5 million 10 years ago. But it's a 100% step up in basis. So let's say, as you'll see these projects, which ironically Harvard and Yale, the two largest endowments, on the right-hand side, 40% is in traditional investing, and they've kind of dumped their hedge funds because hedge funds have really underperformed, but 60% are in what we call this PE space, private equity alternative space, because people are seeking yield, especially pension funds. And in a couple of the projects, HBR 6 and Strategic Energy Asset 3, one was a 18-month turn, the other was a 14-month turn. And in other words, this isn't about drawing a dividend till the well runs dry. These are folks that are turning these funds over and over and over. So the longest project's taken 33 months, The shortest project, 14 months, each respectively averaged about 20%. Well, if you take roughly a 25.5% compounding annual rate of return, in many cases, if that project goes basically 3 years, that's a doubling of the original investment. So let's say somebody's $100,000 became $200,000. And you don't want to pay tax on that. So those that like real estate, and I know a few people in the room like real estate, you can actually 1031 exchange the gain from this type of an account into a piece of real estate, especially if the real estate market falls. Because I got bad news for people that are holding a lot of real estate to be their retirement portfolio. That demographic shift that we have, the peak consumer in this country, age is 47. Between now and 2023, we have the fewest number of 47-year-olds we've ever had in our country's history. So there will actually be, and this comes from a Harvard MBA economist by the name of Harry Dent, we'll actually have more property coming onto the market from people dying than people that want to be buying. So it goes back to supply and demand. So it's a step up. So let's say we've got a lot of clients let's say, started to work with in their 80s, and they're saying, look, Chuck, there's a certain amount of our assets that we're just not going to spend. In fact, some of them have been referred by their adult children in their 50s and 60s, and they've said, hey, how can we protect mom and dad's estate? Well, we work with a lot of people that are looking to reduce their taxable income or looking to convert money out of their IRAs. It makes no difference. It works. Tax Cut and Jobs Act, energy independence, reducing taxable income. I gave that example earlier. Whether you're using it for a Roth conversion offset or whether you're doing it just to reduce your taxable income, especially as I show you the case study. One of my favorites, as I finish with the case studies here because I'm out of time, would be what's called, if you want to make a note, for those of you that are married and have maybe one or both spouses have a 401k. This is the only legal way for you to get money out of your 401k while you're still working for your employer and whether you're 59 and a half or not. I want to repeat that. This is the only way. It's called an in-marriage quadro, qualified domestic relations order. We work with the top attorney in the country that does this. I'll show you a case study of it here as we close. But as you can imagine, one in particular, a medical professional with a competitor of Innovasis, has about $800,000 trapped in his 401k. He's only 55 years old. We stress tested under the custom design portfolio stress test and portfolio performance analysis. We stress tested it. That was his that I showed you earlier. You know, a 5% return for a 12% risk, moving to almost 10% return for under a 6% risk. So sometimes a quadro, as we call it, makes sense. So here's how we'll finish. As I talked about Brian, 55, he wanted to reduce his taxes under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. He used approximately $200,000 of excess cash and saved himself last year in 2019 $70,000 of federal tax. He's a resident of the state of Florida. He didn't have state income tax. Tax-free retirement income planning. So by incorporating the in-marriage quadro, we used a tax wash. And here's what's really cool. If you have a use for that 401k money, you can do the quadro and get the money, okay, without a pre-59 and a half penalty. It's one of only two ways, out of what's called a 72T, to actually get the money out before you're 59 and a half if you take a distribution. Now, you got to pay tax, but as I'm demonstrating, there's ways that you can obviously offset that tax. Tax-free income by using special design insurance. He and his wife, she also works in pharmaceutical sales. They both have strong incomes. We actually moved their retirement up 3 years sooner. We increased their return on her 401k because you can do cross quadros from up to 13.6 from a 5.8, which moved their 10th percentile, right, of wealth increase from 4.3 to 14.8. And I didn't cherry pick that case. I just wanted to use somebody that was mid-50s that was a medical professional who was not a doctor but serves a lot of doctors. Dr. Scott, to protect his last name, is who I was mentioning earlier. 26 years in practice, but in 15 years his income went from $300,000 to 1.3. And I said, what advice would you give to the audience? I gave him a little bit of understanding of the audience I'd be speaking to, and he said, just keep in mind the tax deferred isn't always the winner because we're having to untax, having to do a lot of un-IRA, if you will. He sold his practice this last year and was actually able to reduce the sale by using a saving tax optimization plan strategy by $425,000. And folks, to put that into a reality, imagine that's $425,000 less of a check to write If anybody's wrote a sizable check to the IRS, you know how painful. So you're looking at me like, hell yes. How painful that can be, or heck yes. Tax reduction for future retirement income. He said, Chuck, I'm scared to death of my RMDs. You know, at that time, right, he thought he was only about 9 years away, 8 years away, 7 years away, 7.5, back to 70.5. And so we started un-IRing him, so to speak. We also created a tax-free income that we figured to reverse engineer at 70,000. And then he's using quite a bit to create an outside of Wall Street opportunity through private equity, as I shared some of those programs, for an additional 100,000 of annual income. And it's great. Last I talked to him, he was just getting back from a Panama Canal cruise and was gone for 2 weeks. And part of the sale was to stay on as kind of a consultant. And I would say he's really enjoying himself. Lastly would be Dr. Casilla. These were clients of mine way back when they were 48 years of age. Now we're 10 years later. Those that run a practice, I would share this with you as I close. Practice growth through recruiting and retaining. So that same Jim Harbaugh, well, it's actually referred to in technical terms as what's called a split dollar plan in the tax code. And they actually were able to go, and you'll see this in a moment, by introducing this to the doctors. They actually use it as a recruiting and retaining tool because not only it's a discriminatory plan. They still offer it to the support personnel to their doctors, but the doctors are using it as a tax-free retirement. In their particular case, we reverse engineered so that by 66 we would have them out with a $300,000 of tax-free income, much of which is actually funded through their practice, which means they're getting a deduction on the front end, letting the money grow without tax, and they're actually able to access the money tax-free on the back end. Now, what's really fascinating is they went from recruiting and retaining from 2 offices to 12 offices over these last 10 years, and they've now walked away from a $14 million offer and are entertaining what looks to be, with the proper appraisal and the ESOP opportunity, the way they want to serve their doctors, at about $20 million valuation. This was kind of what I followed up with them, and I said, hey, for those that have an established medical practice, what would you share as it relates to that? She said, you know what, the financial plan we subscribe to has brought us the awareness for a need of better business planning and organization. You know, that's key for all of us, right? To build a better mousetrap. We have experienced steady growth in the practice, as well as we've learned how great it is to have this benefit. We decided to extend it to our doctors, and I think this is the coolest part, to see this family grow, because the husband manages the practice, and she's the main pediatrician. It has been an absolute success in implementing and maintaining Chuck's plan. We extended the plan to include managers of the practice. The practice is thriving. From 1 small office, we now manage 12 medical offices. They have 2 more under contract as we speak, and obviously they've been appreciative. So what would we cover? Why 2020 may be a key year to protect your money. We talked about what's coming, what's changed, and the exposure to high-income earners. How you can set yourself up to thrive in retirement. That way you have a lifestyle, a lifetime, as well as a legacy of financial security and financially thriving medical professional practice. So clear, concise, and customized. This is what it looks like if we were able to talk with you. 1, we profile. 2, we obviously discover. 3, we blueprint. And 4, we manage. So my last question for you might seem a little off the wall, but ironically, I actually shared the same question with 2 gentlemen I met, of all places, in the steam room about 3.5 hours ago. I said, when was the last time you flew through the Chicago airport? Because one had said he was from Chicago, and they were all here for celebrating one of their buddy's 50th birthday parties. One guy was all beat up because his buddies talked him into doing a blue run. It was actually a little humorous. When's the last time, or anyone flying back through Chicago or came through? Okay. So let me ask you a question. I used to fly into Chicago O'Hare Airport. You fly, not Love, but you fly into O'Hare. And it was interesting because we always had a conference over in Rosemont. So we always would have to pick up the shuttle over in the Hilton Hotel, for those that know what I'm talking about. And what's fascinating is the first time I did that, I asked, the information desk, where you can tell the person that you ask questions to really doesn't have any desire to give you information. You know, it's kind of a Seinfeld for those that are Seinfeld fans. And they said, oh, sir, just go down the escalator here into baggage claim, and then just grab your bags and follow the crowd. So I did that. But as I got over finally to the Hilton, the guy I had been riding beside on the same flight, he was eating a Nathan's hot dog and clearly looked like he had never been outside in this time of winter, which is when I was going through it about this time, which is, we know Chicago can be blistering cold and a lot of sleet and snow. And I said, how did you get here like that? And he said, well, didn't you know? I said, didn't I know what? He goes, well, it's not well marked, but if you go down the escalator, in fact, it used to be in yellow, so if you really look, it's there. But if you go down one more floor, you actually go underneath, and then you can take this quick escalator ride right up into the middle of the Hilton Hotel, and you can stand there in the nice warmth and avoid the elements and wait for the shuttle pickup. So my question, or more of a comment to you, would be, don't follow the crowd, right? I think we've made that hopefully pretty clear, because I can tell you, people are really setting themselves up for a very different retirement. Learn how you can have in 3 simple steps. So I'm going to give you an action plan. Several of you have seen taking notes on your cell phone. I took notes on your cell phone. Hold your cell phone up. Who's got their cell phone? Here's the opportunity. Hold up your cell phone. You can simply go to taxessave.com. We made this super simple. Now look, there's zero pressure here, folks. But what I do know, if anyone's familiar with what's called the rule of 72, right? Whatever return you get divided into 72 tells you how quickly that number is going to double. Has anybody ever taught you the second rule of 72? No one? So what the second rule of 72 says, whatever you've learned that you don't take action on within the next 72 hours, it's gone, okay? So taxessave.com. Type best name, best number. We know you're very difficult to reach. Everybody's busy, and best time to reach you if you'd like to see the retirement road you're on versus the one you could be on. So, thank you very much.